This is your brain on risk. This is Mind Over Money, the podcast where Kevin Cook exposes the psychology of investing.
Welcome back to Mind Over Money. I'm Kevin Cook, your field guide and storyteller for the fascinating arena of behavioral economics. Last week, we explored a series of ideas about scientific knowledge and certainty. That episode, Knowledge, Certainty, and Destiny, How to Keep Up with Science and Technology, borrowed part of its title from a book from the 1950s by evolutionary biologist and thought leader Julian Huxley. The title of his book was Knowledge, Morality, and Destiny. In my conversation about the uses and misuses of science and technology, I tried to emphasize how important it is for us to keep open minds about all that's coming at us, literally at the speed of light, from artificial intelligence to gene editing. Speaking of gene editing, last week I talked about CRISPR science and some of the public companies and the history, and I gave you some links to my recent videos. As always, the links are found in the article version of this podcast on Zax.com. It's not a complete transcript of the podcast, but it's usually just a summary of some of the big and important ideas where I can also link to the public companies and any other articles or videos I've written. So as always, if you find the podcast on Zax.com, then you'll have all these links. I want to direct your attention to something I did for my the subscribers to my newsletter called Healthcare Innovators. This week, I sort of summarized what's happening with the FDA. The Food and Drug Administration announced this year sort of a rapid response to all the new gene and cell therapies. And let me see if I can find that right now so I can remember exactly what the title of it was. But anyway, the head of the FDA, I believe his name is Scott Gottlieb. Or maybe that's not his first name. But in any case, he made a bold statement that the FDA has a mission in the next 5 years to approve and bring to market 40 different gene and cell therapies. Now, this covers a wide range of science and companies. Two big areas that I research and invest in are the immuno-oncology stocks, which are the companies that focus on teaching your body's own immune system to fight the cancer that you have. So those have been companies like Juno Therapeutics, Bluebird Bio, which I own, and then the CRISPR companies, which is gene editing. They're using this incredible new technology that they learned is actually 1 billion years old, because it's how bacteria fight off viruses by splitting the DNA of a virus and then basically making it inoperable inside the bacteria. Well, scientists have discovered this, and there were 2 women scientists in 2012, Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuelle Charpentier, who realized this could be used to edit the human genome, and that's what some of the public companies are working on. So those are the big areas of gene and cell therapy, but there are a lot of other ones too. And the FDA wants to make sure that, this, the head of the FDA calls it definitely a paradigm shift has occurred or is occurring in science. And they want to make sure that, they've got an open runway for these, for this science to make it to market, if it's got that chance. Obviously, it still has to get through the FDA gauntlet. So here I am looking at my report. Yeah, Scott Gottlieb is the FDA head, and the FDA they expect to approve 40 gene therapies by the year 2022. If you want a copy of this report, I always tell people, hey, you can get a trial to Zax Ultimate, and then get a look at all the portfolios, not just my Healthcare Innovators portfolio, but where I go over some of these companies. And there's been exciting things happening this week already, because another company we own, Global Blood Therapeutics, symbol GBT, they just released data on their treatment for sickle cell disease. And the results were so encouraging that the company is going to seek accelerated approval from the FDA. So Lots going on with these companies. You can email ultimate@zax.com and find out about getting access to my research and my reports here. Which, I look at a lot of different companies, so then there's always a ton to learn in that area. All right, my subtitle for today's episode is How Technology Changes Human Behavior and Social Rules, but Not Human Nature and Genetics, Yet. And what I'm implying by human nature needs to be explained a little because, it's such a confusing and loaded phrase these days. What is human nature? What do people mean when they say it? I am, of course, referring to a wide open multiple of forces, causes, and drivers, from biological neurochemistry to genetic heritable traits and dispositions. For help in explaining this, I turn to Steven Pinker, author of the new book, Enlightenment Now, that you may have heard about from Bill Gates as his favorite book of the year. Pinker earned his PhD in experimental psychology at Harvard in 1979. Afterward, he did research at MIT for a year. He became an assistant professor at Harvard then and at Stanford. From 1982 until 2003, Pinker taught at the Department of Brain and Cognitive Sciences at MIT. And he was the co-director of the Center for Cognitive Sciences from 1985 to 1994, and he eventually became the director of the Center for Cognitive Neuroscience at MIT from 94 to 99. These credentials are important because, he's not a medical doctor. He got a PhD in experimental psychology, but he's not just a theoretical psychologist philosopher. He had to do deep research on the brain to get these gigs in cognitive neuro. As of 2003, he is the Johnstone Family Professor of Psychology at Harvard. From 2008 to 2013, he also held the title of Harvard College Professor, which I guess is a big deal because it recognizes a professor's dedication to teaching. Of interest is this story that I found on Wikipedia. As a teenager, Pinker says he considered himself an anarchist until he witnessed civil unrest following a police strike in 1969. And this is Pinker describing it. It must be from one of his books. As a young teenager in proudly peaceable Canada during the romantic 1960s, I was a true believer in anarchism. I laughed off my parents' argument that if the government ever laid down its arms, all hell would break loose. Our competing predictions were put to the test at 8 a.m. on October 17th, 1969, when the Montreal police went on strike. This decisive empirical test left my politics in tatters and offered a foretell of life as a scientist. All right, Pinker's eighth book, Enlightenment Now, which I think was just released in March or April. I haven't looked at it yet, but I know a little bit what it's about. It continues the optimistic thesis of his 2011 book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, by using social science data from various sources to argue for a general improvement of the human condition over recent history. And if you liked the book Freakonomics from over 10 years ago, or anything like that, where we use data to actually show people, what trends are and how likely something is, from being shot to drowning in a pool, then you'll probably enjoy Pinker's approach. And you can watch YouTube videos of him basically doing the same thing. He's always going to go to the data and then connect that to what he knows about human nature and human behavior. All right, so The Better Angels of Our Nature from 2011 was actually his sixth book, and I'll get to the first five in a minute here. In that book, Pinker made the case that violence in human societies has, in general, steadily declined with time, and he identifies 6 major causes of the decline. And it has to do with, obviously, improved living standards, the reduction in war and disease and those kinds of things. All right, and I just made a note here to myself. You don't write an 8th book on such pivotal and controversial topics concerning human nature and the current state of civilization without attracting a good deal of academic attention and criticism. And yet, Pinker has few detractors from the sciences relative to his heavy subjects and weighty theories. And now I'll recap his first 5 books to show his specialty in language and cognition. In his popular books, he has argued that the human faculty for language is an instinct, an innate behavior shaped by natural selection and adapted to our communication needs. So his 5 of his books were devoted to this area. The Language Instinct, 1994, How the Mind Works, 1997, Words and Rules from 2000, The Blank Slate from 2002, and The Stuff of Thought, 2007. They all describe aspects of the field of psycholinguistics and cognitive science and include accounts of Pinker's own research. His 7th book, I thought is fun to point out here, is called The Sense of Style, sort of a break from his science-focused work. It's intended as a general style guide that is informed by modern science and psychology, offering advice on how to produce more comprehensible and unambiguous writing in nonfiction contexts, and explaining why so much of today's academic and popular writing is difficult for readers to understand. I certainly hope that Pinker would approve of my attempts to write about science. At least, I don't have a PhD in the way, right? Filling my paragraphs with too much jargon, research references, or massive run-on sentences. Well, once in a while I have a run-on sentence. Now, I have to admit that I've only read half of one of his 5 books on language and cognition, and that's How the Mind Works from 1997. But I love an essay that he wrote for a book from 2003 called The New Humanists, Science at the Edge. It was a collection edited by John Brockman. Let me just read the description, the short sort of preview of Steven Pinker's essay in this book, and his essay is titled A Biological Understanding of Human Nature. I believe there is a quasi-religious theory of human nature prevalent among pundits and intellectuals, which includes both empirical assumptions about how the mind works and a set of values that people hang on those assumptions. The theory has 3 parts. The blank slate, that we have no inherent talents or temperaments because the mind is shaped completely by the environment, parenting, culture, society. The second is the myth of the noble savage, that evil motives are not inherent in people but spring from corrupting social institutions. And the third idea is the ghost in the machine, that the most important part of us is somehow independent of our biology, so that our ability to have experiences and make choices can't be explained by our physiological makeup and evolutionary history. So Pinker, in the essay, sort of tackles these 3 frameworks or paradigms or even mythologies that get in the way of people being able to talk about human nature. And so he's wrapping up after he just explained these 3 ideas. These 3 ideas are increasingly being challenged by the sciences of the mind, brain, genes, and evolution. They are being upheld more for their moral and political uplift than for empirical rationale. People think that these doctrines, the blank slate, noble savage, and ghost in the machine, are preferable on moral grounds, and that the alternative is a forbidden territory we should avoid at all cost. So, Pinker, obviously, he's perfectly willing to talk about his scientific biases. And this will explain a little bit more. Of the 4 new sciences of human nature, cognitive science, neuroscience, behavioral genetics, evolutionary psychology has probably aroused the most controversy in the last decade, much of it needless. There's a sense in which all psychology is evolutionary. When it comes to understanding a complex psychological faculty such as thirst or shape perception or memory, psychologists have always appealed to their evolutionary functions, and that's never been controversial. It's no coincidence that the effects of thirst are to keep the balance of water and electrolytes in the body within certain limits required for survival. Without such a mechanism, organisms would plump up and split like a hot dog on a grill, or shrivel up like a prune. Likewise, it can't be a coincidence that the brain compares the images from 2 eyeballs and uses that information to compute depth. Without such an ability, we'd be more likely to bump into trees and fall off cliffs. The only explanation, other than creationism, is that those systems evolved because they allowed our ancestors to survive and reproduce better than the alternatives. Evolutionary psychology is simply taking that mindset and applying it to more emotionally charged aspects of behavior, such as sexuality, violence, beauty, and family feelings. One reason that evolution is more controversial in these areas than it is in the study of thirst is that the implications of evolution are less intuitive in the case of emotions and social relations. You don't need to know much evolutionary biology to say that it's useful to have stereo vision or thirst. But when it comes to how organisms deal with one another, common sense is no substitute for serious evolutionary theory. We have no good intentions about whether it's adaptive, in the narrowest biologist sense, to be monogamous or polygamous, to treat all your children equally or to play favorites, to be attracted to one kind of facial geometry or another. There you have to learn what the best evolutionary biology predicts. So evolutionary thinking in those fields is more surprising than in the rest of psychology. All right, so that's Pinker, and I mean, I would think that any of his books are worth reading. That essay in particular is short enough to get across the idea. These are some of the biases and blind spots that people have when they approach scientific subjects, especially about human nature, because they're already carrying all this baggage, that he sums up as the blank slate, Noble Savage, or the Ghost in the Machine, that get in the way of being able to learn more about human nature and new scientific information. All right, so we're going to keep moving here. So let me read my subtitle again for this episode so that we can talk about what the last word means. How technology changes human behavior and social rules, but not human nature and genetics. Yet. By yet, I am talking about Yuval Noah Harari's 2017 book, Homo Deus, which I introduced here in a May 2017 episode titled What to Do Before the Machines Take Over. More on historian Harari in a moment. So I usually just say technology changes everything, but I opted to be more specific today. But then again, human behavior and social rules are, in essence, just about everything for us incredibly social creatures. So how does technology change everything? In last week's episode, I touched on the impacts of our ongoing experiments with smartphones, a la Apple, and social media, a la Facebook. And these experiments not only create new behaviors, they reveal ancient human nature in new ways. Just like any good science fiction novel or film puts humans in totally unrealistic circumstances, such as time travel, and then reveals unforeseen conflicts and dilemmas. For instance, did you see the film The Age of Adeline with Blake Lively? Or how about Live, Die, Repeat with Tom Cruise and the incredible Emily Blunt? I recommend Live, Die, Repeat even if you don't like science fiction, if you try and pick up the underlying theme. And the movie was originally released a couple of years before with the title The Edge of Tomorrow. And I guess that didn't fly very well. So, and Live, Die, Repeat actually tells you what happens. Tom Cruise is this, it's in the future, and he's kind of this spoiled corporate punk who somehow has some sort of power connected to the military. And he ends up getting recruited to lead some missions where they're fighting these aliens. But the whole thing is it's like this meta governmental scam with this war and these aliens and who's causing it. And what ends up happening is the same war is fought over and over again each day anew. And Cruz his character gets thrust into this, and it's hell because he keeps getting killed the same way every day. But something happens for his character. One, he meets Emily Blunt, and he likes her, and he wants to help her, and he's now got a reason to figure out this game, this feedback loop that he's trapped in, and so that changes him as a person from a spoiled punk to somebody who cares about another person. And then, but the meta theme here is that sometimes life throws the same stuff at you every day, and it feels like you're trapped in some vicious feedback loop, and every day is the same, and you have the same problems, and And so this is sort of a metaphor for that. What if you knew that it was going to be the same, and yet you tried to keep getting a little bit better every day to beat the machine, so to speak? Because in the movie, Tom Cruise, the same alien monster comes at him the same way every time, and so he just has to learn, oh yeah, I remember what to do here to not get killed, and he has to do the same to help Emily Blunt's character, who's also fighting the same thing. So it's a fun movie, just if you look at it on that level, even if you don't like sci-fi and aliens and that kind of thing. So what do those movies have to do? Well, I'm talking about how, a good science fiction novel or film puts us in different circumstances, but it still reveals human nature, and that's what both of those films do. So again, human nature doesn't change, and we're going to talk about dopamine, one of our favorite hormones, in a moment. But new technology is coming at us really fast, and it will create. I mean, if you think the smartphone, the iPhone, or Facebook change people's behavior or create new addictive behaviors or problems, wait till you see what's coming. I just read a report earlier this year by Bank of America Merrill Lynch technology analysts, where they're looking at the market for augmented reality. And augmented reality could be something as simple as that Pokemon Go game, where people are running around with their phones and they're in some kind of, they're not in virtual reality, they're not in an alternate universe, but they're interacting on a cyber level with reality and their phones. And augmented reality could be a very practical application where a factory worker or a machinist has a pair of glasses on that give them extra information about the machines they're using, safety issues, the content of the air, whatever it is. I mean, whatever could be programmed, and then use Internet of Things technologies to communicate, to provide a worker more information. Obviously, we don't want to think about pilots using augmented reality, but they certainly are, have technological aids that, some never even dreamed of 20 years ago. All right, so this Bank of Merrill reports looked at, in 2016 there were $5 billion attributed to augmented reality businesses, that actual revenue. And they think that's going to grow by over 30 times in the next 5 years to over $160 billion industry. So you can imagine, that's what's coming. And then IBM, who, has IBM's got Watson, they've got their cognitive tools for business corporations. They're talking about the cognitive revolution representing a growing to a $2 trillion industry by the year 2025. And IBM, as they reinvent their business, it hasn't really been that terrific a stock to own. Warren Buffett finally figured that out, and he bought Apple instead in terms of technology. But they understand the uses of big data and analytics and what they call the cognitive revolution. Now, I own stocks like Apple and NVIDIA, who makes the graphical processing chips for, artificial intelligence. And I say you own those two stocks based on these revolutions. I mean, they're a no-brainer. Why? Because Apple is working on what comes after the iPhone, and NVIDIA is the brains behind anything requiring massive parallel architecture, simultaneous, GPU computing. So I say buy Apple every time it dips below 175 and buy NVIDIA below 240. All right. When I come back, we're going to talk about how technology changes everything but human nature by going inside the brain a little bit. I'll be back faster than you can spell norepinephrine. What I didn't go into very deeply last week about Apple's conflict with teenage smartphone addiction or Facebook's issues with anti-social media and fake news is the chemicals swirling through our brains and bodies that make us suckers for such stuff. To fully appreciate our behavior, socially, technologically, and economically, it helps a lot to have some understanding of the brain and the physiological basis of emotions, perception, judgment, motivation, and the repetitive patterns of thought, speech, and action that we lump under the name habits. Since volumes have been written about the 100-plus hormones and neurotransmitters that prompted neuroscientist Candace Pert to call your brain a bag of hormones, I will only try to introduce two of them today. Indeed, in episode number 32, I think, titled The 3 Rules of Wealth for Bull Markets, I gave a brief book review of the newest work from neuroscientist Lisa Feldman Barrett, titled How Emotions Are Made, The Secret Life of the Brain. The book is 400 pages, so there's a lot to talk about on this subject that we'll never get to. Today, we'll rely on Candace Pert to get a better understanding of the importance of hormones and neurotransmitters like dopamine and norepinephrine, what their functions and implications are in a world with no shortage of technology, stimulation, and distractions. And this understanding will help us dive into part 2 of the podcast, where we'll just talk about the weather. Candace Pert was the neuroscientist responsible for the discovery of the opiate receptor, I believe in the 70s, and the opiate receptor is the cellular binding site for endorphins in the brain. She was trained as a pharmacologist, and that in the lab she was working in, she discovered it, and it was almost her discovery was almost sort of stolen from her, as probably has happened to a few female scientists from a generation ago. When I was a kid and a track star, a jogger, endorphins were all the rage, and I hadn't even done any drugs in the 70s, so all I knew about was the runner's high. Let me share more about Candace Pert, and I'm just going to read a few things from Wikipedia here, because they've got an excerpt from the Sydney Morning Herald, who profiled Pert in 2004. As a mere graduate student in 1972, Candace Pert discovered the brain's opiate receptor, the cellular site where the body's painkillers and bliss makers, the endorphins, bond with cells to weave their magic. Pert's discovery led to a revolution in neuroscience, helping open the door to the information-based model of the brain, which is now replacing the old structuralist model. Molecules of Emotion, which was her most important book, begins as an eye-opener into the intellectual warfare of modern scientific discovery, the gamesmanship, the sly purloining of others' results, which I just alluded to, but also the round-the-clock work, the exhilaration of a shared breakthrough, and the slow, painful rise of women in the scientific professions. The book concludes with the author integrating the science she pioneered with the holistic energy medicines which work on the same principle. Okay, so that was what I wanted to read. That's on Wikipedia from the Sydney Morning Herald. So what are dopamine and norepinephrine? So dopamine it's obviously an organic chemical, and it has several roles in the brain and the body. It's most often associated with pleasure, and we know a lot about it because of addiction, because it can be involved in promoting or encouraging our desire for more of, say, a physical substance, whether it's drugs or alcohol, and basically encouraging addiction. So in most plants and animals in the brain, dopamine functions as a neurotransmitter. So basically a chemical released by neurons or nerve cells to send signals to other nerve cells. And the brain includes several distinct dopamine pathways, one of which plays a major role in the motivational component of reward-motivated behavior. So why is this important? Well, because dopamine makes us feel good. It's part of the neurochemistry of feeling good, and it's not just associated with addiction. It's also associated with our social interactions and what makes us feel good. Activities we do by ourselves, whether it's an article you're reading, a musical instrument you're playing, cooking, or your interactions with others. and doing those things. So this is what we've inherited. This is part of our evolutionary heritage, and it's important to learn about it because dopamine's interacting with modern technology. And you see it, it's plain as day when you see 12-year-old kid buried in a smartphone. Their brains are hooked, and you probably would have a hard time taking their phone away from them, or wondering what they would do if they suddenly had to give up their phone for a week or a month. Now, the other hormone that we want to talk about is norepinephrine, which commonly we call it adrenaline, but I don't know if scientists use the word adrenaline anymore. They talk about norepinephrine, also called noradrenaline, and this chemical is released predominantly from the ends of sympathetic nerve fibers, and its goal is to increase the force of skeletal muscle contraction. And how does it do that? By increasing the rate and force of the contraction of the heart and blood flow. Obviously, these are the actions that are vital to what we call the fight or flight response. So you get a burst of adrenaline or norepinephrine that allows you to jump when you're scared by something, or run, or possibly even fight. So all these related hormones that all have the same name, adrenaline, norepinephrine, they increase the heart rate and blood pressure, and also levels of sugar and fat in the blood, so that your cells have access to energy. And these are secreted into the bloodstream by the adrenal glands, basically in response to stress. So we need these chemicals. They help us either get out of danger or respond appropriately when we're threatened. But they also work when you're at the office and all of a sudden you are worried about something that's going on. Or let's say a good example would be, what if all of a sudden you have to stand up and give a presentation and you're not ready, or you don't feel ready? Boy, some norepinephrine's kicking in there. Shirt's getting tight around the collar, you're sweating, blood pressure's up. And so, but these things can happen in interactions too, also with maybe a family member, or maybe a neighbor. You're having an argument, and tempers and so forth start to rise. We'll come back to how the chemicals might be influencing different types of behavior in a minute. I just want to go back to Candace Pert because she helped me think of some other really important ideas here. And, she's cited as having published over 250 academic papers because of her pharmacology background. But she also has some very simple and visceral ideas and ways of talking about the brain. Two that have always stood out to me are: your brain is a bag of hormones, which I already mentioned, and your body is your subconscious mind. We'll get into that one in a second. The first idea instantly communicates something we should never forget. There's a lot going on up there, driven by millions of years of neurochemical evolution. When I was trying to explain the behavior of traders almost 20 years ago, I dove into books by scientists about the brain, as well as those of the behavioral crew like Daniel Kahneman and Richard Thaler. And what I came up with to simplify my understanding and be able to explain it to others was this name: multi-mind. Multi-mind, for me, captured both the multiplicity of brain structures and their sometimes competing functions, and it captured the evolutionary design and purpose of those 100-plus hormones and neurotransmitters swimming around in our bloodstream at different times for different reasons that the body understood and scientists were just still discovering. So this leads into Pert's other important way of teaching when she says your body is your subconscious mind, which was actually the title of her second book, I think. Because if it's all happening throughout your body anyway, the chemicals don't, neurotransmitters and hormones don't just stay in your brain. They move throughout your body. And so in a sense, that's what she's trying to get across. Your entire body is your subconscious mind. So my multi-mind theory was built on these ideas, these kinds of ideas. Actually, they're more than ideas. It's the scientific proof from brain scientists and the evidence from behavioral ones that humans were prone to having many conflicting motives and drives. So it helped me explain why no matter what rules you gave traders and investors, most would tend to break them and do things that looked like self-sabotage in the long run. It even explains the corrupt and cheating behavior of rogue traders and Bernie Madoff, which is something that an example I use. Like, look at what rogue traders do when they steal money, hide trades, break a bank, or what Bernie Madoff did, ripping people off and pretending he's a great trader. You know, these conflicting things that people do with money, you know, they're all over the place. And if you look at them, you can, what I say is that what the rogue trader does to $1 billion, you and I can do to our own trading accounts or financial decision making. So I just made some other notes here to sort of tie in where we're going with this. So now you think about, so that's white collar crime, right? The rogue trader, the Bernie Madoff, you know, they're not physically hurting somebody. It's not a crime of passion, but it is a crime of passion of a different sort, or a crime of stupidity, where they're risking everything and their own self-sabotage to either be seen as a great trader or to get rich or to not have to own up to what they've done. So I summarize all this is like, we are sometimes so naturally irrational. Our tendency is to make money go away from us, right? So, and every investor has to deal with this, right? How are they making long-term decisions? Because we're not always equipped to make long-term decisions. It takes training. So the other area that you could think about this in is anybody trying to change habits or learn new skills and make their life better, become more successful. There's a success coach out there called Darren Hardy. He was the publisher of Success Magazine for about a decade, and he gives a lot of cool talks. But he would say something like, to understand how to be more successful, it's not just about willpower. It's about learning, different productivity hacks, as he calls them. And David Allen, the guy who writes the productivity books like Getting Things Done, he would say the same thing. It's all about having a system. And that's I used a lot of David Allen quotes in my trader training from a previous decade, where I would teach traders, listen, what David Allen says is if you don't have a system so that regular routines get done, you're not freeing your mind up to do what it's supposed to do, which is to create new ideas. And that's why I started teaching traders need to have a system underneath their trading system where things are automatic, habits are encouraged, you create an environment of routine, calm, whatever your research process or trading process is, you need to be systematic about it, or it's so easy to fall prey to the flashing lights on your screen. Another thing that people make, so I talk about people tend to make money go away from themselves. They tend to make success go away. And we tend to make people go away too. And this one I'm definitely guilty of because I remember when I was 18, I was working at a small airport pumping gas, and I was waxing the airplanes and pumping gas of millionaires, people who owned like serious businesses like Illinois Tool Works or Weber Grill. I remember were two of my customers. And I never took the time to get to know these multimillionaires and CEOs. And, now wouldn't I jump at the chance, right? To have learned business, from them when I was 18 or 20. So, and I still do it to this day. I'll I think we all do it. We tend to think, well, what do I invest in this new friendship? Does this person even understand me? Do they even know, this about me, whatever. So I definitely sometimes make people go away from me. I've met great people and somehow lost contact with them. And the fourth thing that people make go away from them are good ideas. And that's where I'm really going with this, is how is it that if we have a disposition to make money go away from us with bad planning and decision-making, could it be that we also have a predisposition to make good ideas go away from us, or rather, we keep good ideas away from us, I should say. We don't even let them get near us. So the same could be, you could talk about money, like either you make your own money go away or you don't attract new money, right? If your goal is to increase your salary by 50%, how many people really make a plan to overcome themselves to go do that? How many people say, you know what, I really suck at this, so this is what I need to learn, or this is how I need to change my career, or approach the interview or hiring process to overcome my bad habits and change my life, change my income, that kind of thing. It's the same thing with new ideas in science. If you have so many filters going on, so many biases and blind spots that you keep away good ideas or new ideas in science and technology, then I think you suffer. And that's where we're going to go with next week's podcast, which will be the part 2 of this. Before I hop there, let's do my little thing on the weather here, because this is sort of the beginning. So last week I skipped over. I didn't talk about global warming at all or climate change, and we're not going to talk about it today. We're just going to talk about the weather, because that'll take a whole episode, and that's what we'll do next week. So before global warming was a thing, imagine a typical conversation about the weather that still goes on today, right? And at the risk of losing 90% of my audience here, I'm going to say that most people hold anti-science ideas and beliefs about the weather. So the question is are you guilty? So here's a typical conversation, right? Sure is hot. Yeah, but then it's supposed to plunge tomorrow. Those weather people never get it right. Last week they said, nah. Or how about this one? This is another one I just made up. This weather can't make up its mind. It's 90 for a week and then 50 degrees and raining. All right, so but this is how people talk about weather, right? And so what is it that they don't get? So here's what I think. If the weather didn't have the extremes that it has, we would not have evolved to be here to even talk about them. All right? And you can, if you read any books about evolution where you're talking about deep time, right? Geologic time over eons, over billions of years, or at least hundreds of millions of years, you start to get this sense of deep time and why weather, varies in a given week, in a given month, in a given century, in a given millennia. My top 3 books on evolution that you should read, I'll remind you, Wonderful Life by Stephen Jay Gould, which is like the deep time history going back to the Cambrian explosion that is all on display in British Columbia in the Burgess Shale. And then Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond, which is the sort of a history of, ever since human civilization, so to speak. And how is it that how is it that we have all these different civilizations with different technologies? Why does it seem that it was Europeans who came up with guns and steel and not other civilizations living at the same time? And Diamond does a really excellent job of painting the picture that, hey, it's about geographic dispersion, It's not about one civilization having a better culture or one civilization having, it's not about race or intelligence, although people will throw that criticism at him. It's about what actually happened in the development of civilizations that were able to have north-south and east-west geographic dispersion, and what that did in terms of the development and transfer of technology. So that's really what Diamond's book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, is about. And obviously, germs play a role when smaller civilizations are suddenly met with a germ from another one. Who wins and who loses there. And then the third book I recommend on evolution is, so we did the first one, Stephen Jay Gould, Wonderful Life, is deep time, of evolution going back 500 million years. Then we do Jared Diamond, which is really about the past 50,000 years. And then Harari is, he subtitles his book A History of the Future because first of all, he's a historian, not a biologist, but he wrote an excellent book about human evolution called Sapiens. And that's the part of history that he wanted to understand, to be able to say in Homo Deus, his book from last year, hey, it seems like where we're going is that the rich will be able to afford biological and neurological enhancements that essentially make them a super race. And so it's kind of a dark dystopia that he's painting, but he's looking at what has happened in culture and technology in the past, when there's been a concentration of power and wealth. And so that's why I think Harari is good to read there too. So the thing about weather, big picture, is if it didn't have so much variation in a given week, season, century, or millennia, you wouldn't be here to complain about it. Now, I'll be the first to admit that I get sad in the wintertime. And pun intended, SAD stands for seasonal affective disorder. A week of gloom in the winter is enough to make me want to stay home, and we know it affects us, but to constantly complain about the weather changing doesn't really understand how weather works. I mean, sure, we'd all love it to be 75 degrees and sunny with a breeze all the time, but that's just not possible. The variation in the extremes is what created the diversity of life and human civilization on the planet. And here's a reason not to be sad. Weather modeling can teach you so much about complex systems, and the only Earth you'll ever be able to talk about with your grandkids. Well, before we terraform Mars as Earth 2.0, that is. So you can think what you wish about the weather, but to me it's all an upside blessing. A wonderful, awesome system created by some pretty amazingly awesome conditions in our solar system. On this mineral and metal-rich rock with these magnificent oceans that all conspire to create life and consciousness. And that's what I think we should teach kids to see, to feel, and to experience about the weather. Not, why is it so darn, insert temperature reference, insert seasonal reference, and why are those blessed weather people always wrong? All right, so next week we are going to come back and we're going to get into the climate discussion. Climate science. I mean, it probably raises a red flag if somebody says climate science. Well, you must be a liberal. But we're talking about science, and the debate about if there is climate change. We just had the 30th anniversary, what was it, on last weekend, of the NASA scientist Hansen, who basically got before Congress and presented his research about the possibility of global warming. So there's a lot of science to look at there, and we have to keep open minds and not make it a political thing, is my view. Like a CEO, like Elon Musk of Tesla, he's not just making fancy electric cars. He's got a vision of where civilization could go with alternative energy sources. And speaking of him, my colleague Tracy Reinick did a podcast this week titled Visionary CEOs. So while Wall Street has a love-hate relationship with Musk's company Tesla, and Goldman Sachs has a sell rating on the stock, Musk is definitely a visionary CEO like Jeff Bezos, which I think is on Tracy's list of top 5 visionary CEOs, and Jensen Huang of NVIDIA. So look for the Market Edge podcast. You can come find it on Zacks.com on the podcast page, Zacks.com/podcasts, and you'll find her Market Edge podcast, or you could just Google it. She's got a terrific show. And just look for that visionary CEOs, and you'll hear about Musk and she likes Restoration Hardware. That guy Gary, I forget his name. She thinks he's a visionary CEO, and I think he is too, just based on what he's been able to accomplish. All right, so next week, come back for part 2. We're going to dive into the climate science. Thanks for joining me. We'll talk to you soon.